I. Opening breakfast discipline and land. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch did not begin with architecture. It began with breakfast. Every morning, millions of identical actions repeated themselves across the United States. Bowls were filled. Milk was poured. Cornflakes softened quietly under routine. There was no ceremony, no spectacle, just repetition. This repetition was not accidental. It was designed. Cornflakes were never only food. They were structure. They transformed eating into a disciplined act, measured, predictable, regulated. A product built not to excite appetite but to control it. The success of cornflakes did not lie in flavor. It lay in normalization. What entered American kitchens was not indulgence. It was habit. From this habit grew an empire. Not one of luxury, but of trust. Not one of excitement, but of reliability. The brand did not promise pleasure. It promised order. And order traveled. Order moved from factories to institutions, from institutions to daily life, from daily life into land. Florida was not an obvious destination for such a philosophy. Florida represented heat leisure, excess escape. It was the opposite of Battle Creek's moral climate. It was where Americans went to relax the rules they lived under elsewhere. That contradiction is precisely why it mattered. When Kellogg acquired land in Florida and developed a large estate, he was not abandoning discipline. He was testing its elasticity. Could a system built on restraint survive in a landscape defined by abundance? Could control coexist with leisure without collapsing into indulgence? The estate was the answer. This was not a palace of excess. It was not a retreat of indulgence. It was not a vacation from values. It was a controlled paradise. The land was expansive, the climate generous, the architecture substantial, but nothing here exploded into spectacle. Even scale was regulated. Even beauty was managed. The estate did not contradict the brand. It extended it. Cornflakes disciplined appetite. The Florida estate disciplined space. Both transformed desire into routine. From a distance, the idea seems contradictory. Why would a man who moralized restraint build a large estate in a region associated with escape? The answer lies in how Kellogg understood power. Power for him was not the ability to indulge. It was the ability to choose when indulgence was allowed and under what terms. The Florida property was not an exception to control. It was a demonstration of it, a space where leisure could exist without disorder, where abundance could be present without excess, where relaxation remained scheduled, contained, and productive. The estate did not loosen discipline. It proved its reach. What cornflakes accomplished at the scale of the body, the Florida estate attempted at the scale of land. Both removed chaos by designing environments where deviation felt unnecessary. This is the story we are entering. Not the story of a cereal brand that became rich, but the story of a worldview that expanded quietly from breakfast tables into architecture, territory, and lifestyle. A worldview that did not need to look powerful to function as power. And Florida, of all places, became its most revealing test. From cornflakes to moral industry, how habit became power. Will Keith Kellogg did not invent cornflakes as a commodity in the modern sense. He developed it as a corrective. From the beginning, the product was framed less as nourishment and more as intervention. It was meant to replace something considered dangerous, indulgent breakfasts, heavy foods, uncontrolled appetite, bodily excess. Cornflakes entered the market carrying a moral premise that eating could be redesigned to produce better behavior. This premise mattered more than profit. Profit followed because the premise aligned with a growing cultural anxiety. Industrial America was accelerating. Cities expanded. Labor intensified. Bodies were expected to function reliably under pressure. Unregulated appetite became a problem to solve. Cornflakes solved it quietly. Not by persuading people to change their values, but by changing their routines. Routine is the most efficient vector of power. Cornflakes did not ask consumers to believe anything. It asked them to repeat something. Every morning, the same action. The same portion, the same texture, the same sequence. Over time, repetition displaced choice. Choice was never removed. It simply became unnecessary. This is how Kellogg understood influence, not as domination but as standardization, not as control imposed from above, but as control internalized through habit. The success of cornflakes demonstrated something crucial, that behavior could be shaped at scale without confrontation. This realization transformed food into industry and industry into moral infrastructure. Once habit could be produced, it could be exported. Once behavior could be standardized, it could be trusted. Cornflakes became reliable not because it tasted exceptional, but because it behaved predictably. That predictability reassured consumers. Reassurance built loyalty. Loyalty stabilized demand. Stability was the real product. Kellogg's factories were not organized around creativity. They were organized around consistency. Process replaced intuition. Measurement replaced appetite. Every variable that could introduce deviation was minimized. This was not just manufacturing discipline. It was a worldview. A worldview in which systems were more trustworthy than impulses and repetition more valuable than desire. Cornflakes succeeded because it fit seamlessly into this worldview, and because it trained consumers to inhabit it unconsciously. The cereal did not promise pleasure. It promised correctness. Correctness scales. As cornflakes moved from niche health product to national staple, Kellogg's influence expanded beyond food. The brand became shorthand for reliability, moderation, and control. Its presence in households normalized a particular relationship between the body and routine. Eating stopped being expressive. It became functional. This functionalization of daily life was not limited to breakfast. It reflected a broader industrial logic that bodies like machines performed best when regulated. Kellogg did not invent this logic, but he refined it and distributed it widely. Cornflakes were the interface. The success of this interface revealed a powerful insight: moral authority could be exercised indirectly through systems that appeared neutral. Food did not look like governance. Packaging did not look like instruction. Distribution did not look like ideology. And yet together they reshaped behavior at scale. This is what turned Kellogg's enterprise into a moral industry. A moral industry does not enforce values. It embeds them. Cornflakes embedded restraint. They embedded predictability. They embedded the idea that moderation was not a sacrifice but a default. Once embedded, these values no longer needed defense. They became normal. Normality is difficult to challenge because it feels natural. People resist rules, but they rarely resist habits they did not consciously choose. This is where Kellogg's influence deepened. The brand no longer needed to explain itself. It simply needed to remain present. Presence required infrastructure. Factories expanded. Supply chains stabilized. Distribution networks widened. Each layer reinforced the others. The system grew more complex, but its output remained simple, a product that behaved the same way everywhere. Uniformity created trust. Trust reduced scrutiny. Reduced scrutiny allowed expansion into new domains. At this point, Kellogg's wealth was no longer abstract. It was anchored in land, labor, logistics, and time. The question was no longer how to sell cereal, but how to manage influence responsibly within the framework he had built. This is where land entered the picture. Land is not just property, it is duration. Factories can be moved. Products can change. Brands can be reinterpreted. Land persists. It anchors ideology and geography. It turns systems into territory. For Kellogg, acquiring land was not about retreat. It was about continuity. The same logic that demanded control over production demanded control over environment. If behavior could be shaped through routine, then space like food could be designed to reinforce that routine. Architecture was the next interface. But architecture introduces risk. Unlike cereal boxes, buildings are visible. They cannot disappear into cupboards. They announce presence. They invite interpretation. Excessive architecture provokes reaction. Insufficient architecture undermines authority. Kellogg had already solved this problem in Battle Creek by choosing restraint. But Florida presented a different challenge. Florida was not neutral territory. It was a place associated with escape from routine, not reinforcement of it. Leisure, climate, abundance, these qualities threatened the logic of discipline. To build there without abandoning control required careful translation of values. The Florida estate would not be a departure from the moral industry. It would be its most complex expression. Cornflakes disciplined appetite. Factories disciplined labor. Institutions disciplined bodies. The Florida estate would discipline leisure. This progression was not accidental. Once a system succeeds at regulating one domain of life, it seeks others. Not out of ambition, but out of consistency. Kellogg's worldview could not tolerate unstructured spaces within its sphere of influence. Florida represented the boundary. The estate was not built to indulge contradiction. It was built to resolve it, to demonstrate that, even in an environment designed for pleasure, order could prevail. That relaxation could be scheduled. That abundance could be contained. This is why the Florida property cannot be understood as a retreat from Kellogg's philosophy. It was its stress test. And stress tests reveal more than successes ever do. By the time the Florida estate took shape, cornflakes had already proven that moral systems could be scaled invisibly. The challenge was no longer scale. It was translation. Could the logic of breakfast survive sunlight, space, and freedom? Could discipline remain intact when indulgence was available? The estate was built to find out. Why? Florida climate as exception. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch was never meant to feel inevitable. Florida did not align naturally with the discipline that defined W.K. Kellogg's worldview. It resisted it at every level: climate, culture, tempo, and expectation. Heat loosened schedules, abundance blurred restraint. Nature refused symmetry. Leisure displaced routine. Florida was not simply different from Battle Creek. It was its inverse. That inversion was precisely why it mattered. Kellogg did not choose Florida because it offered comfort. He chose it because it introduced variables his system had never fully confronted. In Michigan, discipline blended seamlessly with environment. Climate supported order. Seasonal rhythms reinforced routine. Industrial towns rewarded predictability. In Florida, none of those conditions held. Florida accelerated entropy. Sunlight stretched days. Heat slowed movement. Landscapes expanded without obvious boundaries. The environment invited pause, indulgence, and drift. For a philosophy built on regulation, this was not neutral ground. It was destabilizing territory. Building here was not retreat. It was confrontation. Florida forced Kellogg's logic to operate under pressure. The question was not whether discipline could exist in Florida, but whether it could remain intact without hardening into denial. Could order coexist with abundance without collapsing into spectacle? Could restraint survive where excess felt natural? This was not a geographic decision alone. It was philosophical. Climate shapes behavior long before architecture does. Heat changes how bodies move. Light alters perception of time. Abundance dulls urgency. In Florida, nature performed much of the work that Kellogg's systems elsewhere sought to control. This created a paradox. The very conditions that undermined discipline also made it harder to justify enforcing it. Force would have failed here. Subtlety was required. The Florida estate was never conceived as an act of domination over nature. There were no monumental gestures meant to tame the land, no theatrical imposition of symmetry over wilderness. Instead, the estate introduced order gradually, almost apologetically. Land was not conquered. It was organized. This distinction mattered. Aggressive order would have drawn attention to itself. It would have framed discipline as opposition to environment rather than adaptation within it. Kellogg's approach avoided this trap. The estate did not attempt to erase Florida's abundance. It absorbed it selectively. Openness remained, but it was segmented. Green space remained, but it was bordered. Leisure remained, but it was scheduled. Climate was not denied. It was moderated. This moderation required restraint at the architectural level. Any excess in scale would have amplified the environment's invitation to indulgence. Any overt luxury would have contradicted the logic of control. The estate had to remain substantial without becoming seductive. Seduction was the danger. Florida specialized in seduction. It promised escape from responsibility, from routine, from consequence. The estate could not afford to reinforce that promise. It needed to offer something different: leisure without loss of structure. This was a delicate balance. The estate was designed as a buffer zone between nature and habit. It filtered Florida's intensity before it reached occupants. Shade softened heat. Paths directed movement. Views were framed rather than panoramic. The environment was experienced, but never overwhelming. Overwhelm disrupts discipline. By controlling exposure, the estate preserved rhythm. Days still followed structure. Activities remained legible. Even relaxation had boundaries. Rest did not dissolve into aimlessness. This was not accidental. Kellogg understood that discipline could not simply be transplanted. It had to be translated. The Florida estate represents this translation. It did not replicate Battle Creek. It reinterpreted it. Where Michigan enforced order through climate and industry, Florida required order to be architectural. Buildings compensated for what the environment removed. Shade replaced urgency. Segmentation replaced containment. Routine replaced necessity. the estate did not fight Florida. It corrected it. This correction was subtle enough to avoid resistance. Visitors did not experience the property as restrictive. They experienced it as calm. Calm is persuasive. Calm reduces awareness of control. The estate was not rigid. It was steady. Steadiness is how discipline survives pleasure. The choice of Florida also exposed the limits of Kellogg's worldview. In Michigan, discipline appeared natural because it aligned with social expectations. In Florida, discipline required explanation. Even when unspoken, its presence was felt as design rather than default. This difference mattered. In Florida, order could no longer pretend to be inevitable. It had to justify itself through experience. If it felt oppressive, it would be rejected. If it felt arbitrary, it would be ignored. The estate had to feel reasonable. Reasonableness became the new strategy. Instead of enforcing behavior, the environment suggested it. Instead of limiting options explicitly, it narrowed them implicitly. The estate allowed freedom of movement while guiding outcomes. This guidance was never complete. Florida always pushed back. Nature grew faster than boundaries. Heat disrupted schedules. Abundance tempted indulgence. The estate did not eliminate these pressures. It managed them continuously. Management replaced control. This shift is critical. Management accepts imperfection. Control demands compliance. In Florida, Kellogg's system learned to tolerate slippage. Discipline became less absolute, more adaptive. This adaptation did not weaken the system. It extended it. The Florida estate represents the moment when Kellogg's philosophy encountered its most complex test. Not opposition, but temptation. Not scarcity, but abundance. Not urgency, but drift. The estate did not resolve these tensions. It held them. Holding tension without collapse is a form of power. Florida also altered the symbolic meaning of land ownership. In Michigan, land anchored industry. In Florida, land symbolized choice. Choosing Florida meant choosing leisure, but under terms defined by the owner. This is where the estate intersected most clearly with brand logic. Cornflakes offered pleasure without excess. The Florida estate offered leisure without surrender. Both reframed desire as something to be managed rather than indulged. This reframing preserved authority. Yet Florida also revealed something that Michigan concealed: discipline is not universally welcomed. It requires context to feel legitimate. In Florida, where leisure was culturally protected, discipline risked appearing intrusive. The estate avoided this perception by never announcing its intent. It did not frame itself as moral. It did not declare purpose. Its control was environmental, not ideological. Visitors felt guided, not instructed. That distinction protected the system. Florida forced Kellogg's philosophy to abandon certainty. It could no longer assume shared values. It had to operate through compatibility rather than authority. This compatibility softened the system. Soft systems last longer. The estate was not the peak of Kellogg's control. It was its refinement. Discipline here was no longer absolute. It was contextual. It adjusted to climate, culture, and expectation. This adjustment did not signal weakness. It signaled maturity. Florida did not break the system. It exposed its elasticity. That elasticity would later determine whether the estate could survive beyond its original purpose. Buildings that cannot adapt to environment or interpretation fail when conditions change. The Florida estate had already practiced adaptation from the moment it was conceived. It never assumed alignment. It engineered it. In doing so, the estate became something more complex than a retreat or residence. It became a demonstration of how power behaves when it cannot rely on consensus. It learned to hide inside reasonableness. Reasonableness is disarming. By the time the estate was complete, it no longer represented contradiction. It represented compromise, not compromise as concession, but as strategy. The Florida climate did not defeat discipline. It forced it to evolve. That evolution is what allowed the estate to exist without collapsing into indulgence or hardening into denial. It became neither a palace of excess nor a fortress of restraint. It became an exception that held. And in holding it revealed the true ambition of Kellogg's philosophy: not to eliminate pleasure but to survive it. IVV architecture as controlled escape. When leisure is designed, Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch was never conceived as an escape from order. It was conceived as a test of whether order could survive escape. Architecture in this context did not function as shelter or display. It functioned as mediation, between climate and habit, between abundance and restraint, between the impulse to relax and the need to remain governed. Florida did not require architecture to protect inhabitants from nature. It required architecture to protect a philosophy from nature. The estate's buildings were not designed to dominate the land. They were designed to interrupt it just enough to slow it down. The heat remained, but it was filtered. The openness remained, but it was segmented. The lushness remained, but it was framed. Nothing here erased Florida. Everything here edited it. This editorial approach marked a departure from earlier expressions of Kellogg's worldview. In Battle Creek, architecture reinforced discipline by aligning with climate and industry. In Florida, architecture had to compensate for what the environment removed: urgency, friction, and natural boundaries. The buildings became instruments. They did not assert authority through mass or ornament. They asserted it through calibration. Every element served to regulate exposure, how much sun reached the body, how far the eye traveled, how long movement could remain unstructured. Unstructured movement was the enemy. In climates like Florida, unstructured movement quickly becomes aimless. Aimlessness dissolves routine. Routine dissolves control. Architecture intervened at this precise point. Paths were defined but not rigid. Spaces were generous but not infinite. Views were open but never panoramic enough to overwhelm orientation. Orientation is a form of discipline. The estate's architecture ensured that orientation was never lost. One always knew where one was, how one arrived, and how one would leave. This clarity mattered more than comfort. Comfort without clarity invites drift. Drift undermines systems. Unlike palatial architecture that signals leisure through excess, the Florida estate signaled leisure through containment. It allowed relaxation, but it refused surrender. Spaces were designed for pause, not abandonment. Rest was accommodated, but always within a framework that preserved awareness of time and sequence. There were no spaces that dissolved into timelessness. Timelessness is dangerous. In many leisure estates, timelessness is the goal. Days blur, hours dissolve, routine suspends itself. The Florida estate rejected this model. Time remained legible. Morning, afternoon, and evening were distinct. Activities followed rhythms that echoed industrial schedules rather than vacation fantasies. This did not make the estate uncomfortable. It made it stable. Stability was the underlying objective of Kellogg's architecture everywhere. Stability of habit, stability of behavior, stability of meaning. In Florida, stability had to be engineered actively because the environment did not supply it naturally. The buildings acted as buffers. They absorbed Florida's intensity before it reached occupants. Shade moderated heat. Overhangs softened light. Enclosed transitions slowed movement between interior and exterior. These features did not dramatize climate. They normalized it. Normalization was the final refinement of control. The architecture never announced its purpose. It did not present itself as corrective. It simply felt reasonable. Reasonableness disarms critique. It encourages acceptance. The estate never framed leisure as something to be resisted. It reframed it as something to be organized. Organization is more palatable than restriction. The scale of the estate reinforced this logic. Large enough to suggest abundance, but never so large as to require spectacle to justify itself. The buildings did not compete with the land for attention. They withdrew slightly, allowing nature to remain present while ensuring it never dictated behavior entirely. This balance required restraint. Restraint in Florida is counterintuitive. Everything about the landscape encourages expansion of views, of movement, of sensation. The estate resisted this expansion without appearing defensive. It introduced gentle limits that felt natural rather than imposed. These limits were architectural, not verbal. Walls defined space without enclosing it completely. Openings framed vistas rather than releasing them fully. Furniture arrangements encouraged posture and duration rather than collapse. Even materials contributed to this effect. Solid, durable, but never lush. Luxury was carefully avoided. Luxury would have undermined the logic of controlled escape. It would have introduced a narrative of reward rather than regulation. The estate was not meant to reward discipline with indulgence. It was meant to demonstrate that discipline could coexist with pleasure without transforming into indulgence. This distinction is subtle. Indulgence implies loss of boundary. Pleasure here remained bounded. Architecture enforced those boundaries quietly. The Florida estate also avoided theatrical contrast between interior and exterior. In many tropical estates, interiors dramatize coolness as escape from heat. The Kellogg estate softened this contrast. Interiors were cooler but not dramatically so. The body was not shocked into relief. Shock disrupts continuity. Continuity preserves routine. By minimizing sensory extremes, the architecture prevented the environment from becoming an event. Florida did not perform itself here. It was experienced as condition rather than spectacle. This reduced the psychological impact of leisure. Leisure without spectacle is easier to govern. The estate's architecture also minimized opportunities for improvisation. Spaces were clearly defined in purpose. Rooms did not invite reinterpretation. Outdoor areas were programmed implicitly through layout. There were few ambiguous zones where behavior could drift. Ambiguity invites experimentation. Experimentation invites deviation. Deviation was not forbidden. It was unsupported. This is the most important distinction in the estate's design philosophy. Control did not operate through prohibition. It operated through omission. By not providing spaces for certain behaviors, those behaviors became unlikely. Architecture replaced instruction. The estate never needed rules posted or schedules enforced. The environment itself suggested what was appropriate. Suggestion is more durable than command. Commands provoke resistance. Suggestions feel voluntary. Voluntary compliance is the most efficient form of control. The Florida estate represents the point at which Kellogg's architectural philosophy became fully environmental. Rather than shaping behavior through institutions or routines alone, it shaped behavior through atmosphere. Atmosphere is difficult to argue with. One does not rebel against atmosphere. This atmospheric control extended to sound movement and even social interaction. Spaces did not amplify voices. They did not encourage gatherings that escalated energy. Interaction remained contained, conversational calm. Calm was the desired emotional register. Calm stabilizes systems. The estate did not eliminate pleasure. It eliminated intensity. Pleasure remained, but it was flattened. Without peaks, there were no crashes. Without excitement, there was no exhaustion. The environment sustained equilibrium. Equilibrium is a managerial ideal. Florida challenged this ideal constantly. Nature resisted equilibrium. Growth was rapid, weather unpredictable, seasons less defined. Architecture compensated by providing constancy. Buildings did not change with weather. Interiors did not fluctuate dramatically. The environment inside remained legible even when the environment outside did not. This separation preserved routine. Routine does not require sameness everywhere. It requires sameness somewhere. The estate provided that anchor. It is important to note what the estate did not do. It did not attempt to educate visitors explicitly. It did not frame itself as a moral space. It did not display didactic messages. Its control was never ideological on the surface. Ideology invites debate. The estate avoided debate by remaining experiential rather than declarative. Visitors did not leave with lessons articulated. They left with habits subtly adjusted. Pace slowed. Movements became more deliberate. Leisure felt contained rather than expansive. This effect was cumulative. Over time, the estate demonstrated that leisure could be absorbed into a disciplined life without threatening it. This demonstration mattered more than any argument. It extended the reach of Kellogg's worldview into a domain that typically resisted regulation. Architecture made this extension possible. Without architecture, Florida would have overwhelmed the system. Without architecture, leisure would have dissolved discipline. The buildings acted as translators, converting environment into something compatible with Kellogg's logic. This translation was never perfect. Tension remained. Florida always pushed back. Heat invited pause. Space invited wandering. Nature invited excess. The estate did not defeat these invitations. It negotiated with them continuously. This negotiation required maintenance, not just physical but conceptual. Maintenance is a form of vigilance. The architecture did not relax after completion. It required ongoing alignment between use and intent. Any drift towards spectacle or indulgence would have undermined the system. The estate's success depended on sustained restraint. Restraint, when sustained, becomes invisible. Invisibility protected the estate. It did not attract criticism for moralizing leisure because it did not announce itself as doing so. It did not provoke resentment by denying pleasure outright. It simply reshaped pleasure into something quieter. Quiet pleasure does not mobilize opposition. This is why the Florida estate survived as a functional expression of Kellogg's worldview, longer than more explicit forms of control. It adapted discipline to environment without dramatizing the adaptation. The architecture never declared victory. It never needed to. By designing leisure rather than rejecting it, the estate revealed the true ambition of Kellogg's philosophy. It was not to eliminate desire, but to manage it so completely that it no longer threatened order. Florida did not corrupt discipline. It refined it. That refinement is embedded in the architecture, not as monument but as method. The buildings do not ask to be admired. They ask to be used correctly. And in being used, they continue the work they were designed to do, to regulate without confrontation, to structure without spectacle, to allow escape without surrender. This is architecture as controlled escape, not freedom from order, but order that learned how to survive freedom. The estate as extension of the brand when a product becomes land. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch did not exist apart from the brand that financed it. It functioned as the brand translated into space. Cornflakes were never marketed as indulgence. They were framed as correction, an answer to excess, unpredictability, and bodily chaos. Their success lay in a promise that did not need to be repeated consistency. Every bowl behaved the same way. Every morning followed the same logic. The product became invisible by becoming dependable. The Florida estate followed this same principle. It did not need to announce its connection to Kellogg's philosophy because it embodied it operationally. Where cornflakes standardized appetite, the estate standardized leisure. Where the product disciplined consumption, the land disciplined experience. This was not branding in the visual sense. It was branding as behavior. The estate did not carry logos or slogans. It did not stage performances of wealth. It did not dramatize ownership. Instead, it reproduced the same effect cornflakes had achieved at scale. It normalized a particular way of being without appearing to instruct it. This normalization was the core asset. Brands usually depend on repetition of message. Kellogg's depended on repetition of practice. Cornflakes trained consumers to expect regularity. The Florida estate trained occupants to expect structure even in moments designed for relaxation. Expectation is where power settles. Once expectation is established, enforcement becomes unnecessary. This was true for breakfast, and it was true for land. The estate's architecture and use patterns created a predictable rhythm that mirrored industrial schedules without replicating industrial pressure. The brand's success had already demonstrated that predictability was not experienced as restriction when it aligned with perceived well-being. The estate tested whether this logic could extend into a domain where unpredictability was culturally valued. Leisure culture thrives on exception. The Florida estate converted exception into routine. This conversion required careful calibration. A brand can be rejected if it appears to intrude into private life too aggressively. A property can provoke resentment if it imposes values incongruent with its setting. The estate avoided both outcomes by never appearing to impose anything at all. It offered an environment that felt reasonable. Reasonableness was the brand's most powerful attribute. Cornflakes succeeded because they did not ask consumers to make a dramatic change. They fit easily into existing routines. The Florida estate succeeded for the same reason. It did not demand that occupants abandon leisure. It shaped leisure into a form compatible with discipline. Compatibility matters more than persuasion. The estate's daily rhythms echoed the logic of the product that funded it. Mornings began with structure. Activities followed sequence. Rest was integrated, not isolated. Even leisure had a place in the schedule rather than existing outside it. This rhythm was not enforced through rules. It emerged from design. Design replaced messaging. This was a critical evolution. As Kellogg's brand matured, it relied less on explicit moral framing and more on experiential alignment. The Florida estate represents this mature phase. It did not frame itself as health-oriented or corrective. It simply felt orderly. Feeling orderly is persuasive. The estate also functioned as a demonstration, though not a public one, of how far the brand's philosophy could travel. Cornflakes had entered kitchens. The estate entered geography. Both demonstrated that systems of moderation could scale without losing coherence. Scaling without spectacle was the brand's defining skill. Most wealth expresses itself by increasing visibility as it grows. Kellogg's wealth expressed itself by increasing stability. The estate was not built to be noticed. It was built to work. Work here did not mean labor. It meant function. The function of the estate was to maintain continuity between values and environment. This continuity protected the brand indirectly. A brand associated with restraint could not afford to appear hypocritical through indulgent architecture. The estate avoided this risk by refusing indulgence without rejecting comfort. Comfort was controlled. Controlled comfort reinforced credibility. Credibility allowed the brand to persist without explanation. The estate also reinforced the brand internally. It provided a space where Kellogg's philosophy could be lived without contradiction. Employees, associates, and visitors experienced the same logic in physical form that they encountered through the product. This experiential consistency mattered. When ideology is experienced rather than argued, it becomes difficult to challenge. The estate did not argue that discipline was good. It demonstrated that discipline could be pleasant. Pleasant discipline is powerful. It removes the sense of sacrifice. It reframes restraint as balance rather than denial. This reframing allowed Kellogg's worldview to extend into Florida without triggering resistance. The estate thus became a three-dimensional expression of the brand's promise. Life could be orderly without being oppressive, regular without being dull, structured without being severe. This promise had already been proven at the scale of food. The estate proved it at the scale of life. Importantly, the estate did not rely on novelty to sustain interest. Novelty demands escalation. Escalation undermines stability. The estate avoided novelty by repeating itself. Days resembled one another. Spaces reinforced consistent behavior. Nothing encouraged reinvention. Reinvention threatens systems. By resisting reinvention, the estate preserved coherence. This coherence mirrored the brand's refusal to chase trends. Cornflakes did not rely on seasonal variation or dramatic reformulation. The product stayed largely the same, trusting that consistency would outlast fashion. The estate adopted the same posture. It did not attempt to redefine leisure. It normalized a particular version of it and remained there. Remaining was the strategy. This strategy also protected the estate from becoming symbolically overloaded. Many large properties become museums of intent. They require explanation. They invite critique. The Kellogg estate avoided this fate by never presenting itself as an argument. It presented itself as a condition. Conditions are harder to dismantle than statements. The brand's influence had always operated at the level of condition. Cornflakes changed what breakfast felt like, not what it meant. The estate changed what leisure felt like, not how it was discussed. Discussion invites opposition. Feeling invites adaptation. The estate allowed occupants to adapt themselves quietly. Behavior adjusted without debate. Pace slowed. Attention narrowed. Routine reasserted itself even in the presence of abundance. This reassertion was subtle. Subtlety preserved legitimacy. The estate also demonstrated that branding does not require visibility to be effective. In fact, visibility can be counterproductive. By avoiding obvious brand markers, the estate avoided being read as a corporate extension. It felt personal, even modest in ambition. This perception mattered. A corporate estate would have provoked suspicion. A personal estate invited acceptance. The brand's values were present, but they were not labeled. Labeling would have exposed the system. Exposure weakens influence. The estate's success, as an extension of the brand, depended on remaining unlabeled. It did not announce that it represented Kellogg's philosophy. It allowed that philosophy to operate invisibly. Invisibility was the brand's ultimate refinement. The estate also functioned as a rehearsal space for future adaptations. Florida forced Kellogg's worldview to accommodate difference. This accommodation did not dilute the system. It strengthened it by proving its flexibility. Flexible systems survive longer. The brand that could operate in both Michigan and Florida could operate anywhere. The estate demonstrated this portability. It showed that discipline could be environmental rather than climatic. That routine could be designed rather than enforced. This demonstration had implications beyond architecture. It suggested that Kellogg's philosophy was not bound to a specific culture or region. It could travel, it could adapt, it could persist. Persistence was the real objective. The estate did not seek to impress contemporaries. It sought to remain functional across contexts. This long view distinguished Kellogg's approach from other industrial magnates whose estates reflected personal ambition rather than systemic thinking. The Florida estate was not a monument. It was infrastructure. Infrastructure supports behavior without drawing attention to itself. Roads shape movement without announcing intent. Utilities regulate life without demanding admiration. The estate functioned similarly. It regulated leisure quietly. This quiet regulation aligned perfectly with the brand's operational ethos. Cornflakes regulated mornings quietly. The estate regulated days quietly. Both reduced friction by removing unpredictability. Unpredictability is expensive. The estate reduced the cost of leisure by making it predictable. Predictable leisure does not disrupt productivity. It does not threaten routine. It does not require recovery. This alignment protected the brand from internal contradiction. Kellogg's public image as a promoter of moderation would have been undermined by a conspicuously indulgent estate. By building restraint into the property, Kellogg avoided this fracture. Avoiding fracture was essential. Brands fracture when values diverge from practice. The Florida estate prevented divergence by translating values directly into environment. Practice aligned with philosophy without requiring enforcement. Enforcement was unnecessary. The estate also demonstrates how brands can outlive their founders by embedding values into systems rather than personalities. Even if Kellogg were absent, the estate would continue to operate according to its design logic. Design outlasts intent. This is why the estate matters as part of the brand's legacy, not because it was large or impressive, but because it functioned correctly. It performed its role without demanding recognition. Recognition was never the goal. The brand did not need monuments, it needed continuity. The Florida estate provided continuity under challenging conditions. It absorbed difference without collapsing. It allowed pleasure without surrender. It maintained order without coercion. This was the brand's highest achievement. Not success measured by growth or acclaim, but success measured by stability across environments. The estate demonstrated that Kellogg's philosophy could survive outside the conditions that first nurtured it. Survival is the true measure of power. By functioning as an extension of the brand, rather than an exception to it, the Florida estate revealed the depth of Kellogg's system. It was not limited to food or health or industry. It was a method for organizing life. And that method did not need to be named to be effective. Life, inside the Florida property, leisure without surrender. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch was not designed to feel like a retreat from responsibility. It was designed to feel like responsibility had simply changed form. Life inside the Florida property did not unfold as escape. It unfolded as translation. The rhythms that governed Battle Creek were not abandoned here. They were softened, stretched, and resequenced to survive a different environment. What disappeared was urgency. What remained was structure. This distinction defined daily existence on the estate. In many leisure properties, life is organized around interruption. Meals interrupt rest. Activities interrupt routine. Entertainment interrupts time. On the Kellogg property, interruption was minimized. Days did not fracture into events. They flowed through predictable segments that mirrored industrial logic without reproducing its pressure. Morning was still morning. Afternoon still belonged to activity. Evening still closed the cycle. Time was never allowed to dissolve. This mattered more than comfort. Comfort without time creates drift. Drift erodes habit. Habit was the foundation of Kellogg's worldview. Even in Florida, habit remained the anchor. Daily life on the estate was structured not by rules but by environment. Spaces suggested behavior. Movement implied sequence. The architecture did not need schedules posted on walls. The body learned quickly where to go, when to pause, when to proceed. Learning happened unconsciously. The estate did not feel regimented. That was the achievement. It felt calm. Calm disguised control. Calm reduced awareness of structure. When structure feels natural, it is rarely questioned. Life here was quiet but not idle. Activities existed, but they did not escalate. Recreation did not become spectacle. There were no dramatic gatherings designed to rupture routine. Social interaction remained measured. Conversation did not compete with environment. The estate did not amplify presence. Amplification invites performance. Performance undermines discipline. By removing opportunities for performance, the estate preserved equilibrium. Occupants did not feel observed. They did not feel required to impress. This absence of social pressure reduced the impulse to exceed boundaries. Boundaries existed without being announced. Meals provide the clearest example of how life inside the estate was shaped. Eating did not become an event. It remained integrated into the day as function rather than indulgence. Portions were adequate. Timing was consistent. The environment discouraged excess without condemning it. Food did not dominate attention. This continuity with Kellogg's philosophy of eating was deliberate. Cornflakes had redefined breakfast as routine rather than pleasure. The Florida estate extended this logic to all meals. Nourishment supported activity. It did not interrupt it. Eating here was neither celebratory nor restrictive. It was correct. Correctness is a powerful stabilizer. Rest, too, was reframed. Rest did not mean withdrawal from order. It meant temporary reduction of intensity within a still governed system. Spaces for rest did not isolate occupants from structure. They softened engagement without suspending it. There were no zones where time ceased to matter. Sleep followed pattern. Waking followed pattern. Even relaxation had rhythm. The estate did not offer escape from self-regulation. It offered relief without release. This is a subtle but crucial difference. Release implies abandonment of control. Relief implies reduction of strain while maintaining orientation. The Florida property specialized in relief. It removed pressure without dissolving form. Life inside the estate trained occupants to experience leisure as managed experience rather than spontaneous indulgence. This training did not feel educational. It felt intuitive. The environment did the work. Furniture reinforced posture rather than collapse. Seating did not encourage extended inactivity. Rooms did not invite aimless wandering. Movement always led somewhere. Direction remained intact. Privacy existed, but it was contained. Private spaces did not function as retreats from expectation. They were quieter but not indulgent. Solitude did not become withdrawal. Even alone, the environment reinforced order. This continuity mattered. Many systems fail when private life diverges from public values. The Florida estate avoided this divergence by embedding the same logic everywhere. There was no backstage where discipline relaxed fully. Discipline softened, but it never disappeared. This was the estate's defining feature. The climate constantly tested this logic. Heat slowed bodies. Light extended days. Nature invited pause. The estate did not fight these forces aggressively. It absorbed them gradually. Shade slowed movement without stopping it. Breezes cooled without encouraging inertia. Outdoor spaces allowed exposure without exhaustion. Exposure was calibrated. Calibration is labor. The estate required maintenance not only to preserve physical structures, but to preserve experiential balance. Gardens had to be trimmed to prevent wildness from becoming dominant. Paths had to remain clear to preserve direction. Spaces had to remain legible to prevent drift. Maintenance was continuous. This continuity of maintenance mirrored the industrial processes that sustained Kellogg's brand. Just as factories required constant calibration to produce consistent output, the estate required constant adjustment to maintain experiential consistency. Consistency was the objective. Life inside the estate did not accumulate unpredictably. It did not evolve through improvisation. Change was gradual, controlled, and often invisible. Days resembled one another closely enough to reinforce habit without becoming oppressive. This balance was delicate. Too much sameness would have produced boredom. Too much variation would have undermined structure. The estate navigated this tension by allowing small, non-disruptive differences, changes in weather-light activity, while preserving the overall frame. The frame did not move. This framing allowed occupants to experience Florida without surrendering to it. Nature remained present, but it did not dictate behavior. Leisure remained possible, but it did not expand unchecked. Unchecked leisure was the risk Kellogg had identified. Life inside the estate demonstrated that leisure could be absorbed into a disciplined life without transforming into excess. This demonstration was experiential rather than ideological. No one was told to behave moderately. They simply did. The estate did not reward deviation. It did not punish it either. It made deviation feel unnecessary. When environments support certain behaviors consistently, alternatives lose appeal. Appeal is not removed. It fades. Over time, occupants internalized the estate's logic. Pace slowed naturally, attention narrowed, excess felt out of place without being condemned. This internalization was the estate's greatest success. Control became self-maintaining. This self-maintenance did not require surveillance. There was no need for oversight. The architecture itself provided guidance. Guidance replaced enforcement. Enforcement creates resistance. Guidance creates habit. Habit was Kellogg's preferred instrument. The Florida estate also reveals the limits of this approach. Life inside the property was stable but not expansive. Creativity was not emphasized. Expression was not encouraged. The environment prioritized equilibrium over exploration. This was intentional. Exploration introduces risk. Risk disrupts systems. The estate minimized risk by minimizing variables. This made life predictable. Predictability made life manageable. Manageability preserved order. Order, however, comes at a cost. Over time, the lack of release can create subtle tension. When leisure never fully disengages from discipline, it loses some of its restorative potential. Relief becomes maintenance. Rest becomes another function to perform. The estate did not address this tension directly. It absorbed it. Absorption is easier than resolution. Life inside the Florida property did not break. It continued. But continuity does not guarantee fulfillment. It guarantees stability. Kellogg valued stability over fulfillment. This priority shaped the lived experience of the estate. Occupants did not experience extremes. They did not experience collapse or excess. They experienced steady days, predictable rhythms, and controlled pleasure. This experience aligned perfectly with the brand's ethos. Cornflakes did not promise delight. The estate did not promise escape. Both promised reliability. Reliability is comforting, but reliability is not inspiring. The estate was not meant to inspire. It was meant to function, and function it did as long as occupants accepted its terms. Acceptance was rarely questioned because the environment did not provoke challenge. It did not feel oppressive. It felt reasonable. Reasonableness is persuasive. As long as reasonableness aligns with cultural values, systems persist. When values shift, reasonableness can feel limiting. The estate's life was stable, but it depended on a shared tolerance for structure. This dependence would matter later. For now, life inside the Florida property represented the fullest realization of Kellogg's philosophy. Discipline had learned to coexist with leisure. Control had softened without disappearing. Habit had expanded into environment. The system worked. It worked quietly. And in working quietly, it revealed both the strength and the eventual vulnerability of a worldview that sought not to dominate life but to organize it completely. VII. Fractures when control meets its limits. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch did not fail in any visible way. There was no collapse of structure, no abandonment of property, no public rejection of values. What appeared instead was quiet strain. Strain does not announce itself. It accumulates beneath systems that continue to function. The Florida estate reached this condition gradually, not because its architecture stopped working, but because its logic encountered diminishing returns. Control had done everything it was designed to do. And that was the problem. For years, the estate succeeded by absorbing contradiction. Leisure existed without excess. Abundance remained contained. Discipline softened without dissolving. This balance held because the cultural environment still tolerated structure as a virtue. But tolerance is not permanent. As cultural attitudes toward leisure shifted, expectations changed. Leisure began to be framed not as relief from work, but as compensation for it. Pleasure became expressive rather than restorative. Escape became something to be celebrated rather than moderated. The Florida estate did not evolve with this shift. It remained what it had always been. This constancy exposed the first fracture. What once felt reasonable began to feel restrictive, not because restrictions increased, but because surrounding norms changed. The estate's architecture did not tighten. Its rhythms did not harden. Its discipline did not escalate. But it became visible. Visibility changes perception. When control operates invisibly, it feels natural. When it becomes noticeable, it invites evaluation. Occupants began to perceive the limits that had always existed but had previously felt benign. Leisure without release became noticeable. Routine without variation became legible. Order without negotiation became apparent. Nothing had changed structurally. Everything had changed experientially. This is how fractures form in disciplined systems. Not through rebellion, but through awareness. Awareness turns habit into choice. Choice reintroduces friction. Friction weakens internalized control. The estate was not designed to respond to friction. Its strength had always been preemption, removing conditions under which friction would arise. But Florida's environment continued to evolve culturally even as the estate remained stable. Stability became rigidity by comparison. The estate's architecture did not allow reinterpretation. Spaces had clear purposes. Movement followed predictable paths. There were no zones of ambiguity where new behaviors could emerge organically. Ambiguity is where adaptation begins. Without ambiguity, adaptation requires redesign. Redesign was never part of the plan. This rigidity did not manifest as discomfort immediately. It manifested as disengagement. Occupants moved through the estate correctly but without attachment. The environment no longer shaped behavior actively. It merely constrained it. Constraint without conviction feels empty. The estate's logic depended on shared belief that moderation was desirable. As that belief weakened, the environment lost persuasive power. It could still regulate behavior, but it could no longer justify why. Justification matters. Control without justification becomes visible as control. Once visible, it invites resistance, not dramatic resistance, but quiet withdrawal. People complied less enthusiastically. They sought stimulation elsewhere. They treated the estate as background rather than guide. Background control loses leverage. The Florida estate was not equipped to escalate. Escalation would have required overt rules, explicit enforcement, or symbolic reinforcement. None of these fit Kellogg's philosophy. The system had been designed to operate without confrontation. When confrontation became necessary, the system had no language for it. This was the second fracture. The estate could not argue for itself. Architecture cannot explain intention. It can only repeat form. As cultural narratives around leisure shifted, the estate continued to perform the same script. That script no longer resonated universally. Resonance is fragile. Without resonance, order persists only mechanically. Mechanical order does not inspire loyalty. The estate also faced a deeper tension discipline that never releases, eventually exhausts its own rationale. Leisure, when fully managed, ceases to feel like leisure. It becomes maintenance. Maintenance preserves systems, but it does not replenish them. This depletion did not cause collapse. It caused thinning. The estate's influence thinned. Its capacity to shape behavior weakened. It continued to function, but its effect narrowed. What had once governed experience broadly now governed only surface behavior. Surface behavior is easy to imitate. Deep behavior requires belief. Belief was no longer guaranteed. Florida amplified this fracture because it offered constant alternatives. Beyond the estate's boundaries, leisure was evolving rapidly. Expressive pleasure, spontaneity, and escape culture grew more visible. The estate's restraint began to feel out of step. Out of step is not failure, but it is isolation. The estate became isolated ideologically, not rejected but bypassed. People followed its rhythms while they were present, then sought intensity elsewhere. The environment no longer contained desire. Containment had been the estate's core function. Once desire escaped, containment control lost relevance. This was not a dramatic moment. It was a slow realization. The estate could no longer compete with an expanding culture of leisure without betraying its own principles. To become more indulgent would have undermined its philosophy. To remain restrained risked irrelevance. This is the central fracture. A system designed for moderation struggles in a culture that celebrates excess. A system designed for normalization struggles in a culture that values expression. The estate could not satisfy both. It chose consistency. Consistency preserved form. It sacrificed influence. The architecture remained unchanged, but its meaning shifted. What had once been interpreted as balance was now read as limitation. What had once felt calming now felt quiet to the point of absence. Absence of stimulation is not neutral in leisure contexts. It reads as denial. The estate never intended denial. It intended regulation. But intention does not control interpretation. Architecture does not get to choose how it is read once values shift. This is where fractures become irreversible. The estate could not adapt without redesign. Redesign would have required admitting that discipline alone was insufficient. Kellogg's system was not built to make that admission. Instead, the estate absorbed fracture by withdrawing from instruction. It stopped trying to shape. It allowed itself to be used rather than lived through. Use is less demanding than belief. This withdrawal prevented open conflict. The estate did not become a site of critique. It became a site of quiet neutrality. Its presence no longer provoked discussion. Provocation invites change. Neutrality preserves existence. The fracture then did not destroy the estate. It reclassified it. From active system to passive environment. From guiding structure to background setting. This reclassification was the beginning of survival. But survival came at the cost of purpose. The estate no longer demonstrated Kellogg's philosophy in full. It demonstrated only its residue. The habits it once normalized now had to be chosen consciously, and conscious choice is less stable than habit. Stability was never fully recovered. The Florida estate continued to function, but it no longer governed experience beyond its physical boundaries. Its influence stopped traveling. It remained contained. Contained systems persist. Expansive systems evolve or collapse. The estate chose containment by default. This is the quiet outcome of fracture in disciplined architectures. They do not explode. They contract. They preserve themselves by narrowing relevance. The Florida estate reached this state without drama. No fire tested it. No economic collapse forced it to change. No public scandal demanded reinterpretation. Time did the work. Time changed expectations. Time exposed rigidity. Time reduced alignment. The estate responded not by resisting time, but by ceasing to compete with it. Competition requires adaptation. The estate chose persistence. This choice prepared it for the next phase not as a system of control but as a stable artifact that no longer needed to persuade. What came next was not restoration, it was normalization. ZYI. Survival through reframing when control steps back. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch did not survive by winning an argument. It survived by no longer making one. When the fractures appeared, the estate did not respond with reinforcement. It did not double down on discipline. It did not clarify its philosophy. It did not attempt to modernize itself aggressively. Instead, it did something quieter and more effective. It reframed itself. Reframing is not change. It is repositioning. The estate did not alter its architecture. It did not redesign its spaces. Its buildings remained intact. Its paths remained legible. Its rhythms remained steady. What changed was how those elements were understood and what they were expected to do. Expectation is where survival begins. As long as the estate was expected to shape behavior, its diminishing influence felt like failure. Once it was no longer expected to shape anything, its continued existence felt unproblematic. This shift did not require announcement. It occurred through gradual normalization. The estate stopped being instructional. It became contextual. Context does not demand obedience. It allows coexistence. This was a critical transition. Disciplined systems collapse when they continue to insist after their authority fades. The Florida estate avoided this fate by withdrawing its insistence before resistance hardened. Withdrawal was not retreat. It was timing. The estate recognized implicitly, not consciously, that its strength had never been persuasion. It had been compatibility. As cultural attitudes toward leisure shifted, compatibility became more valuable than coherence. The estate allowed itself to be reinterpreted as environment rather than example. This reinterpretation protected it. Once the estate was no longer read as a moral space, its restraint lost ideological weight. What had once felt prescriptive began to feel neutral. Neutrality dissolved tension. Tension attracts scrutiny. Neutrality diffuses it. The estate did not need to justify why it was restrained. It simply was. Visitors and occupants no longer asked what the space meant. They asked only how it felt. And how it felt was calm, orderly, and unprovocative. Unprovocative architecture survives. The Florida estate became background. Background architecture does not compete with trends. It does not age dramatically. It does not demand restoration to preserve meaning. It can persist quietly because it no longer carries symbolic burden. This reduction of burden was decisive. Many large estates fail because they remain trapped in their original symbolism. They must constantly be explained, curated, or defended. The Kellogg estate avoided this trap by allowing its symbolism to thin out. Thinning is safer than erasure. As the estate's original philosophy lost cultural urgency, its architectural expression softened into atmosphere. Discipline became orderliness. Control became clarity. Regulation became predictability. These qualities are widely tolerated even when their origins are forgotten. Forgetting is not loss. It is insulation. By being forgotten as a system, the estate became insulated from critique. It was no longer measured against evolving ideals of leisure or freedom. It existed on its own terms, which were modest enough to avoid confrontation. The estate's survival was not heroic. It was procedural. Procedure outlasts ideology because it does not depend on belief. The estate continued to function procedurally. Spaces worked, circulation made sense, maintenance remained manageable. There was no pressure to transform. Transformation invites attention. Attention invites judgment. Judgment invites conflict. The estate avoided all three by remaining operational rather than expressive. This operational posture allowed it to coexist with a culture that no longer shared its founding assumptions. It did not need alignment. It needed acceptability. Acceptability is achieved not by agreement, but by absence of offense. The estate offended no one. It did not challenge contemporary leisure culture. It did not celebrate it either. It occupied a middle zone where it neither endorsed nor rejected prevailing values. This ambiguity allowed multiple readings. Multiple readings prevent fixation. Fixation is dangerous for architecture. When buildings become fixed symbols, they become targets of nostalgia, critique, or reinvention. The Kellogg estate resisted fixation by remaining ambiguous. It was neither a monument to discipline nor a playground of excess. It was simply a place. Places endure longer than statements. The reframing process also involved a quiet decoupling from the Kellogg brand. The estate no longer needed to function as an extension of corporate philosophy. The brand had already diffused its influence elsewhere. The estate's role as demonstration became unnecessary. Necessity had passed. Once necessity passes, insistence becomes liability. The estate avoided this liability by relinquishing its demonstrative role. It did not insist on being understood as Kellogg's Florida vision. It allowed itself to be read differently or not at all. This openness was strategic. Openness reduced the need for preservation narratives. The estate did not require a story to justify its existence. It did not need to be framed as historically significant in a narrow sense. It could be valued for utility, calm, or continuity without invoking ideology. This flexibility protected it from obsolescence. Obsolescence occurs when form is too tightly bound to a specific purpose that no longer exists. The Kellogg estate loosened this binding by allowing purpose to dissolve, while form remained. Form without fixed purpose is adaptable. The estate did not repurpose itself dramatically. It did not reinvent its spaces. It allowed use to shift gradually. Gradual shifts are less disruptive than deliberate transformations. Deliberate transformations invite debate. Debate threatens survival. By avoiding debate, the estate maintained presence. Presence without pressure is the safest state for architecture. The Florida estate reached this state by letting go of ambition. It no longer sought to exemplify an ideal. It no longer sought to test philosophy. It simply continued to exist as a coherent environment. Coherence is enough. This reframing also altered how time interacted with the estate. When architecture insists on meaning, time erodes that meaning. When architecture does not insist, time becomes neutral. Time stopped being adversary. The estate did not fight time by modernizing or preserving itself theatrically. It allowed time to pass through it. Aging did not feel like decline because there was no promise of timelessness to betray. Promises create vulnerability. The estate made none. Its survival strategy was humility without self-awareness. It did not humble itself actively. It simply avoided arrogance from the beginning. That avoidance paid dividends when cultural winds shifted. Other estates demanded relevance. This one accepted irrelevance. Acceptance is powerful. By accepting that it no longer needed to matter ideologically, the estate freed itself from expectations that could not be met. It became compatible with whatever context surrounded it. Compatibility ensures longevity. The Florida estate survived because it no longer needed to justify discipline. Discipline had already done its work. What remained was structure that could function without explanation. Function is resilient. As long as spaces worked, the estate could remain. It did not need admiration. It did not need defense. It did not need reinterpretation. It needed maintenance. Maintenance is achievable. This is the quiet truth of the estate's survival. It did not require rescue. It did not require reinvention. It required only that nothing force it to speak when it had nothing left to say. Silence protected it. Silence allowed it to fade from contention into continuity. By stepping back from control, the estate ensured that it would not be challenged for controlling too much. By no longer shaping behavior actively, it avoided criticism for failing to do so convincingly. This withdrawal was not defeat. It was resolution. The estate resolved its own tension by changing the question it was answering. It stopped asking whether discipline could survive leisure. It began answering whether architecture could survive without purpose. The answer was yes. Survival through reframing does not look like success. It looks like absence of failure. The Kellogg, Florida estate did not triumph. It endured. And endurance in architecture is often the most honest measure of power. What remains? Land, habit, and a quiet afterlife. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch remains without insisting on remembrance. Nothing about the estate demands interpretation anymore. It does not present itself as a manifesto. It does not frame itself as a cautionary tale. It does not claim to represent a lost philosophy or a defeated one. The buildings remain, the land remains, and the order embedded in both continues to function at a low, steady frequency. What remains is not power in motion. It is power at rest. The estate no longer governs behavior beyond its boundaries. It no longer shapes cultural norms or demonstrates an ideal. Its original ambition to prove that discipline could coexist with leisure has already been resolved by history. The question no longer needs an answer. What remains is residue. Residue is often mistaken for irrelevance. In reality, residue is how systems outlive their moment. When a philosophy withdraws from visibility, it does not disappear entirely. It leaves traces, habits, expectations, spatial logics that persist without attribution. The Florida estate is such a trace. The land still carries segmentation. Paths still suggest movement. Spaces still imply use. Even without instruction, the environment continues to shape behavior gently. Visitors slow down. Attention narrows. Pace adjusts. Not because anyone asks them to, but because the space encourages it. Encouragement without authority is subtle. It is also durable. The estate's afterlife is defined by this subtlety. It no longer acts as a system of control. It functions as a condition, one that can be entered and exited without friction. The absence of obligation allows the space to remain relevant without being contested. Contest requires stakes. The estate no longer carries stakes. This lack of stakes protects it. Buildings that represent unresolved conflicts attract scrutiny. Buildings that represent completed processes fade into acceptance. The Kellogg, Florida estate belongs to the second category. Its philosophical work is done. What remains is land that has been shaped carefully enough to resist chaos but lightly enough to avoid rigidity. The estate does not revert to wildness, nor does it require constant assertion of order. Maintenance continues, but it is practical rather than symbolic. Symbolic maintenance is expensive. Practical maintenance sustains. The estate's architecture does not need explanation to function. It does not rely on historical framing to justify its form. Its rooms remain usable. Its circulation remains clear. Its proportions remain adequate. Adequacy is sufficient for survival. The estate also remains because it never demanded emotional investment. Emotional investment can sour. Admiration can fade. Reverence can turn to critique. The Kellogg estate avoided these risks by never seeking them. It was never designed to be loved. It was designed to work. Working architecture ages better than beloved architecture. Love demands reciprocity. Work demands only continuation. The estate continues because nothing about it requires response. This neutrality also allows the estate to absorb new meanings without conflict. It can be seen as historical, functional, or simply present. None of these readings exclude the others. There is no single narrative that must be protected. Narratives create vulnerability. The estate is protected by narrative thinness. What remains, then, is not a story that needs to be told loudly. It is a configuration that can be occupied quietly. This quiet occupation is the estate's final role. It no longer shapes ideology. It hosts life. Hosting is less demanding than governing. As a host, the estate does not instruct guests how to behave. It does not require alignment with its founding values. It offers an environment that is orderly enough to be usable but open enough to accommodate difference. Accommodation is the last stage of power. Power that once organized life now allows life to pass through. This transition is not loss, it is completion. The estate has reached a state where it no longer needs to prove anything. Proof invites challenge. The estate does not invite challenge. Its survival is not dramatic. It does not depend on rescue or rebranding. It does not require constant reinterpretation. It simply remains within acceptable bounds of use and expectation. Acceptability is underestimated. Acceptable spaces persist because they are not pressured to change. They do not provoke action. They do not demand justification. They are left alone. Being left alone is rare for large estates. The Kellogg, Florida property earned this condition by never presenting itself as exceptional. Even at its height, it avoided spectacle. Now in its afterlife, it avoids nostalgia. Nostalgia distorts. The estate does not need to be mourned because nothing here feels lost. Its order has not collapsed. Its restraint has not failed. It has simply settled into a quieter role. This settling mirrors the trajectory of Kellogg's broader influence. Cornflakes did not remain revolutionary. They became normal. The brand's philosophy did not remain debated. It became background. Background influence is the most successful outcome a system can achieve. The estate mirrors this outcome spatially. Its influence is no longer recognized as influence. It is experienced as environment. This is the final absorption of power into daily life. What remains is also absence. The absence of tension, the absence of urgency, the absence of a need to resolve anything. Resolution has already occurred. The estate does not stand as a warning about control or a celebration of discipline. It stands as evidence that systems designed carefully enough can step back without collapsing. Collapse is loud. This estate avoided loudness from the beginning. Time interacts gently with such architecture. Aging does not feel like decline. Change does not feel like threat. The estate does not resist reinterpretation, nor does it demand it. Demand creates friction. The estate creates none. In this sense, the Kellogg, Florida property represents a rare architectural afterlife. It exists without performing memory. It does not need to remind anyone of what it once represented. It does not require preservation as an object of reverence. It requires only care. Care is sustainable. Care does not require belief. It requires attention. Attention can be practical rather than ideological. The estate receives just enough attention to remain functional and no more. This balance ensures longevity. What remains finally is a quiet demonstration of how power can end without being overthrown. The estate was not defeated by time. It was completed by it. Its original function, testing the limits of discipline in a space of leisure, has been answered. The answer did not require a monument. It required endurance. Endurance without insistence is the rarest form of success. The estate achieved it by letting go of control at the right moment, by not clinging to relevance, by not insisting on meaning. What remains is not authority. What remains is compatibility. Compatibility allows architecture to exist across eras without friction. It allows land to hold memory without enforcing it. It allows space to remain useful without being explained. This is the estate's quiet afterlife. It does not speak. It does not instruct. It does not persuade. It remains. Silent ending, when nothing needs to be proven. Kellogg Arabian Horse Ranch still exists. Not as a destination, not as a symbol, not as an argument. It exists in the way systems exist after they have finished doing what they were built to do. There is no sense of victory here. There is no sense of loss. The estate does not stand as evidence that discipline triumphed over leisure, nor that leisure dissolved discipline. It stands as evidence that a system can complete its task and step aside without collapse. That outcome is rare. Most architectures of power do not know when to stop. They continue to insist long after their authority has faded. They demand interpretation, preservation, reverence, or critique. In doing so, they provoke the very forces that undo them. This estate did not insist. From the beginning, it avoided spectacle. From the beginning, it avoided confrontation. From the beginning, it avoided the need to be admired. These choices were not modesty. They were foresight. Foresight is invisible when it works. The Florida property was never meant to impress the future. It was meant to function in the present without creating problems for the future. That is why it aged without drama. Time did not have to defeat it. There was nothing here to overthrow. The philosophy that shaped this land did not die. It dispersed. It moved into habits, products, expectations, and routines that no longer required architectural reinforcement. Once dispersion was complete, the estate's role diminished naturally. This is how systems end when they succeed. They do not collapse. They dissolve. Dissolution leaves no ruins. What remains is land that does not argue with its surroundings, buildings that do not compete for meaning, spaces that do not demand allegiance. The estate does not challenge contemporary values, nor does it celebrate past ones. It is compatible with indifference. Indifference is often misread as failure. In architecture, indifference is survival. The estate no longer teaches. It no longer regulates. It no longer tests ideas. It hosts weather, time, and occasional presence. Its order remains, but only as background structure. Background structure is powerful precisely because it does not announce itself. The estate does not need to be remembered intensely to remain. It does not need to be framed as heritage to justify its care. It does not need to be narrated constantly to avoid disappearance. It avoids disappearance by avoiding conflict. Conflict would require it to take a position. Taking a position would require relevance. Relevance would require explanation. Explanation was never part of its design. The most striking aspect of this ending is how little it feels like an ending. There is no final transformation, no conversion into museum or monument, no symbolic closure. The estate remains in use, or at least in readiness. Readiness is different from purpose. Purpose demands fulfillment. Readiness allows continuation. This readiness is the estate's final state. It is prepared to exist without instruction, prepared to be entered without ceremony, prepared to be left without consequence. This is not emptiness, it is completion. The Florida estate completed its task when it proved that discipline could survive abundance without becoming excess, and when it learned to withdraw before that discipline became an obstacle to survival. Withdrawal was not weakness. It was timing. Timing is what distinguishes endurance from obsolescence. The estate timed its silence correctly. It stopped speaking before it was forced to. It stopped demonstrating before demonstration became unnecessary. It stopped insisting before insistence would have produced resistance. Few architectures manage this. Most are too loud to hear the moment when quiet becomes necessary. This one was not. In the end, the estate does not ask what history thinks of it. It does not measure itself against other legacies. It does not demand judgment. It waits. Waiting is not passive here. It is the final form of control relinquished voluntarily. The system that once organized life now organizes nothing beyond its own maintenance. Maintenance is enough. Nothing dramatic happens here anymore. And, because nothing dramatic happens, the estate remains. That is the final lesson, if it can be called a lesson at all. Not that power must be displayed. Not that discipline must dominate. But that the most durable forms of influence are those that know when to disappear into normality. The house does not speak. And because it does not speak, it survives. This is where the story ends. Not with resolution, but with quiet continuity,